Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Kendra Blackwood and I am 26 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 months. This happened during the fall of 2023, when the missing person case of Ezra Caldwell turned into something that still haunts me. I was still new to the job, desperate to prove myself capable of handling real emergencies, when I volunteered for what should have been a routine search and rescue operation. The call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt more like winter than October. Ezra Caldwell, 19 years old, had failed to return to the Hoh River campground after setting out alone the previous morning with his camera equipment. His Honda Civic sat abandoned in the parking lot, keys locked inside while his tent remained perfectly set up with all his personal belongings untouched. The college student from Seattle had told the camp host he planned to photograph old-growth cedar groves along the unmarked trails, deeper in the rainforest section. I remember the metallic taste of nervous anticipation as I studied his registration card. Clean handwriting, local address, no emergency contacts listed except his mother in Bellingham. The photograph on his driver's license showed a thin young man with serious dark eyes and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time indoors than hiking wilderness trails. Something about his earnest expression made my chest tighten with protective responsibility. "First solo missing person case," Chief Ranger Patricia Voss observed, watching me organize my equipment with the methodical precision they'd drilled into us during training. "You sure you don't want backup?" The question stung. 8 months in, and I still felt like everyone was waiting for me to fail, to prove that hiring a 26-year-old woman with more academic credentials than field experience had been a mistake. My degree in environmental science and search and rescue certification meant nothing if I couldn't handle a simple missing hiker case. "Protocols say one ranger for standard missing person searches within the first 24 hours, I replied, checking my radio twice. "Besides, he probably just got turned around on the unofficial trails. I'll have him back before dark." Chief Voss nodded, but her weathered face showed the kind of skepticism that comes from 30 years of seeing cocky rookies learn hard lessons in unforgiving wilderness. "Radio check every hour. If you don't find signs of him by sundown, we call in search and rescue teams from Jefferson County." The weight of proving myself pressed against my ribs as I hiked toward Ezra's last known location. October in the Olympic Peninsula meant darkness would fall before 6 p.m., giving me less than 3 hours of useful daylight. The ancient rainforest swallowed sound in a way that made my footsteps seem unnaturally loud, on the spongy trail carpeted with centuries of decomposing cedar needles and moss. I found Ezra's first clue 30 minutes into the search. Fresh footprints in a muddy section where Clearwater Creek crossed the main trail. Size 10 hiking boots. Deep tread impressions indicating he carried substantial weight in his camera pack. The prints headed northwest toward the unmarked deer paths that wound deeper into old-growth territory. "Base, this is Ranger Blackwood," I radioed, feeling a flutter of confidence. "I've got clear tracks heading off trail from the creek crossing, following northwest toward the Cathedral Grove area." Static crackled through the response, but Chief Voss's voice came through clearly enough. "Copy that, Blackwood. Stick to established protocols and keep me updated." The forest grew denser as I followed Ezra's trail away from the maintained paths. Douglas firs older than European civilization rose like cathedral pillars into a canopy so thick that even midday felt like twilight. The air hung heavy with moisture and the rich scent of perpetual decay, while every surface sprouted elaborate gardens of moss and fern that muffled sound until the wilderness felt tomb quiet. Ezra's footprints became harder to follow on the thick carpet of fallen leaves, but I caught glimpses of disturbed vegetation and occasional clear impressions in softer earth. My training kicked in automatically. Photograph each track, note direction and spacing, document time and location. The methodical process steadied my nerves and made me feel competent, professional. Then I found his camera. The expensive digital SLR lay partially buried under a pile of freshly fallen maple leaves about 2 miles from the main trail. My stomach dropped as I photographed it in place, before carefully lifting it free. No obvious damage to the body, though the lens cap was missing and dead leaves clung to the strap. The camera felt cold and slightly damp, as if it had been there overnight. I scrolled through the images on the display screen, hoping for clues about where Ezra had been when he lost it. Most shots showed the expected forest compositions: towering cedar trunks, shafts of filtered sunlight, artistic close-ups of moss and fungal growths. But the final images made my hands start trembling. The last dozen photographs weren't artistic nature shots. They showed the same section of forest from slightly different angles, all taken in rapid succession, as if Ezra had been photographing something specific, something that had caught his attention enough to fire off multiple frames. But I couldn't see anything unusual in the shots, just trees and undergrowth that looked identical to the forest surrounding me. Then I noticed the metadata timestamps. The final photograph was taken at 4:23 p.m. the previous day, less than 2 hours before sunset. If Ezra had lost his camera that late in the day, he would have been hiking back to camp in near darkness through unfamiliar terrain. "Base, this is Blackwood," I called, trying to keep concern out of my voice. "I've found the subject's camera equipment approximately 2 miles northwest of the creek crossing, requesting guidance on expanding search parameters." The radio crackled with static so severe I could barely make out fragments of Chief Voss's response. "Copy. Expand search. Call if..." "Base, please repeat. I'm getting heavy interference." More static, then nothing. I tried different channels, adjusted the antenna, even moved to higher ground. But the radio produced only white noise punctuated by occasional bursts of what sounded like conversation from some other frequency. Technical problems happened in deep wilderness, especially with the complex terrain of the Olympic Peninsula creating radio shadows. But the timing felt wrong. The failing daylight forced a decision. I could return to base and report Ezra's camera discovery, bringing back a full search team in the morning. Or I could push deeper into the forest while I still had enough light to follow his trail, potentially finding him before he spent another night exposed to October temperatures that would drop into the 30s. The choice felt like a test of my competence. A real ranger wouldn't abandon a missing person because of radio problems and approaching darkness. I had emergency gear, training, and several hours of flashlight battery. Finding Ezra before hypothermia became a factor would prove I deserved to wear the uniform. I GPS marked the camera location and continued following what remained of Ezra's trail deeper into the unmarked wilderness. The footprints became increasingly erratic, sometimes doubling back or circling the same area as if he'd become disoriented. In one muddy depression, I found where he'd apparently fallen, leaving knee and handprints alongside his boot marks. The forest felt different as afternoon faded toward evening. Birds that should have been active during the day remained silent, while the usual rustling of small mammals through undergrowth was completely absent. Even the ever-present dripping of moisture from the canopy seemed muted. The unnatural quiet made me hyper-aware of my own breathing and the soft squelch of my boots on saturated earth. I tried the GPS unit to maintain my bearings as the trail became harder to follow. The device powered on normally, satellites connected, but when I checked my position it showed me in a location that made no sense. According to the display, I was somehow 3 miles southeast of where I'd started, back near the main trailhead. I recalibrated twice with the same impossible result. "Technical difficulties," I muttered, falling back on map and compass navigation while fighting growing anxiety. Electronic equipment failed in wilderness conditions. That was why we trained with traditional tools as backup. But having both radio and GPS malfunction on my first solo case felt like the kind of rookie luck that would become station house legend. The compass bearing seemed reliable, pointing me consistently northwest toward the higher elevation ridges where Ezra might have been heading for better photographic vantage points. I marked my trail with orange flagging tape every 100 yards, creating a breadcrumb path back to civilization even if the electronics couldn't be trusted. As twilight deepened, I switched to my primary flashlight and immediately caught a reflection about 50 yards ahead, something metallic glinting between the trees. My pulse quickened as I approached, hoping to find more of Ezra's equipment. Instead, I discovered something that made my mouth go dry with fear. A crude shelter had been constructed in a natural clearing between several massive cedar trunks. Not the kind of emergency bivouac a lost hiker might throw together, but a deliberate, semi-permanent structure using cut branches, salvaged tarp material, and what looked like stolen Park Service supplies. Empty MRE packages and water purification tablets suggested someone had been living here for an extended period. But it was the photographs that made my hands shake as I examined them by flashlight. Dozens of pictures were pinned to a makeshift bulletin board made from a piece of plywood. Not nature photography, but surveillance shots of park visitors taken with a telephoto lens, hikers on trails, families at campsites, couples by streams, all photographed from concealed positions without the subject's knowledge. Many photos showed people alone in isolated locations, with notes written in the margins indicating dates, times, and detailed observations about their equipment and behavior. At the center of the display, circled in red marker, was a photograph of Ezra Caldwell. The image showed him setting up his camera on a tripod in what I recognized as the exact location where I'd found his equipment. But the photograph had been taken from an elevated position, looking down at Ezra as he worked. Someone had been watching him, following him, documenting his movements through the forest. Below Ezra's photo, a handwritten note read, EC, Day 1, solo hiker, expensive equipment, predictable route patterns, no backup contact, initiated contact protocol 1600 hours. My training evaporated as pure terror flooded my nervous system. This wasn't a missing person case. This was an abduction, possibly worse. Someone was using the vast wilderness of Olympic National Park as a hunting ground, stalking isolated visitors and documenting their patterns like a predator studying prey. I had to get out immediately and bring back law enforcement with proper resources. But as I turned to flee back down my flagged trail, a voice called out from the darkness behind me. Ranger Blackwood. I spun around, flashlight beam dancing wildly through the trees, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voice had been male, calm, and it had used my name. Who's there? I called, trying to project authority while my hand fumbled for the pepper spray on my duty belt. This is Park Service property. Show yourself immediately. Soft laughter drifted from multiple directions, as if the speaker was moving through the forest with practiced stealth. You're even younger than your personnel file indicated. 8 months on the job, degree in environmental science, no prior law enforcement experience. Volunteered for this assignment against your supervisor's recommendation. The casual recitation of personal information that should have been confidential made my blood feel like ice water. I've called for backup. They know my exact location. Your radio hasn't worked properly since you passed the 2-mile marker. I've been monitoring Park Service frequencies for 3 years now. Easy enough when you know all their communication protocols. As for your GPS, another laugh, closer now. Amazing how accurate those units are until someone introduces a simple jamming device to the equation. I ran. Training said to maintain visual contact with suspects, attempt de-escalation, call for backup, follow established procedures. But training hadn't prepared me for someone who knew those procedures better than I did, who had turned my own equipment against me and isolated me in terrain he obviously knew intimately. My flagging tape trail should have led directly back toward the main hiking paths, but after 20 minutes of stumbling through darkness, I realized I was moving in circles. Markers I'd placed myself appeared in impossible locations, sometimes hung at eye level when I remembered tying them to branches above my head. He was moving them, rearranging my breadcrumb trail into a maze designed to keep me lost in his territory. The flashlight beam caught movement between distant trees, a human silhouette that vanished the moment I focused on it. Then another, from a different direction. Either multiple people were stalking me, or he was moving with supernatural speed through terrain he'd mapped down to every tree and rock. You're thinking like prey now instead of a predator, the voice observed from somewhere behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing. That's the difference between experienced rangers and rookies. Experience teaches you that humans are the most dangerous species in any ecosystem. I stopped running and tried to control my panic. He wanted me afraid and disoriented, making desperate mistakes. My only advantage was that I'd grown up hiking these mountains, even if I didn't know this specific area. The topology was familiar, steep ridges dropping toward creek beds, game trails following natural contour lines, specific tree species indicating elevation and moisture levels. The compass still worked. If I could maintain a consistent bearing toward the main park road, I'd eventually intersect with established trails or reach areas where my radio might function again. I just had to move carefully, quietly, without advertising my position with the flashlight. "Very good," he said approvingly, switching to survival mode. "But you're still thinking like someone who believes in rescue, in backup arriving, in civilization's safety net. Out here, there's just you and me and several thousand acres of wilderness where people disappear permanently." I bit my tongue to keep from responding. Any sound would give away my position. Moving by feel and starlight through the dense understory, I tried to put distance between myself and his voice while heading toward what I hoped was the park boundary. Then I smelled smoke. Not the clean scent of a campfire, but something organic and wrong. Meat cooking, but with an underlying chemical odor that made my stomach clench with primitive revulsion. The smell grew stronger as I moved through a section of younger trees that had grown up after some old logging operation. In a small clearing ahead, I could see the orange glow of a fire. Against every instinct screaming at me to run in the opposite direction, I crept close enough to see what was creating that horrible smell. Ezra Caldwell sat tied to a tree at the edge of the firelight. He was alive. I could see his chest moving, but clearly injured. His face was swollen and marked with what looked like deliberate cuts, while his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Most of his clothes had been removed, leaving him exposed to the October cold. But he was breathing, conscious, and looking around with the glassy awareness of someone in shock. Relief and terror warred in my chest. I'd found him, but the situation was far beyond anything my training had covered. This wasn't wilderness first aid or routine search and rescue. This was a crime scene with an active perpetrator somewhere in the darkness around me. The smart play was to retreat, get back to civilization, and return with law enforcement officers who had proper equipment and tactical training. But Ezra might not survive another night of exposure, especially with his injuries. And something in his expression, a desperate hope when he sensed movement at the edge of the clearing, made abandoning him feel impossible. I keyed my radio one more time, hoping distance from the electronic jamming might have restored communication. Nothing but static. My GPS unit still showed impossible locations. Even my digital watch displayed the wrong time, cycling through different hours, as if its circuitry was being corrupted by some external interference. "He's been waiting for you," the voice said quietly from directly behind me. I spun around to face him, finally seeing my stalker clearly in the reflected firelight. Matthias Cray looked exactly like what he was, a man who had once worn a park ranger uniform with pride and authority. Even after 3 years of living rough in the wilderness, he maintained military posture and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His hair and beard had grown long and unkempt, while his skin showed the weathered bronze of someone who lived entirely outdoors. But his Park Service equipment was meticulously maintained, and the way he moved through the forest showed decades of professional experience. "You're not the first ranger to come looking for missing persons," he continued conversationally, as if we were discussing routine park business instead of kidnapping and torture. "But you're the first one young enough and inexperienced enough to walk directly into an obvious trap. Your predecessors would have called for backup the moment they found surveillance photos." "Let him go," I managed, trying to project authority while my voice shook with terror. "You're a former ranger. You swore an oath to protect people in these parks." "I protected them for 15 years, Cray replied calmly, "right up until park administration decided my methods were too aggressive for dealing with poachers and illegal campers. Apparently, breaking a few fingers to discourage wildlife trafficking makes you unsuitable for public contact." His laugh held bitter edge. "So now I protect the park from visitors in my own way." I could see Ezra watching us with growing awareness, understanding that his rescue had become another trap. The kid was smart enough not to make noise that might escalate the situation, but his eyes held the kind of despair that comes from realizing help wasn't coming. "You've been living out here for 3 years, I said, trying to keep Cray talking while I looked for escape routes or weapons. "Taking people who come into the park alone. Teaching them that the wilderness isn't their personal playground. City kids like your friend there think they can wander into 900,000 acres of old-growth forest with a camera and Instagram account treating sacred places like a theme park. His voice hardened with genuine anger. They need to learn respect. By torturing and murdering them? By showing them what real predators look like? What happens when you wander alone into territory that belongs to something more dangerous than you? He gestured toward Ezra with casual indifference. Most of them don't survive the lesson, but they die understanding that humans aren't the apex predator they thought they were. The fire crackled between us, casting shifting shadows that made distance and movement hard to judge. My pepper spray and emergency radio were on my duty belt, but Cray was close enough to stop me before I could deploy either effectively. He moved with the balanced grace of someone completely comfortable in this environment, while I felt clumsy and obvious in comparison. "You're going to untie him," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "And then you're going to let both of us walk out of here." "No," Cray replied pleasantly. "You're going to learn the same lesson he's learning. The difference is that you have training and equipment that might let you survive long enough to make it interesting." He pulled a hunting knife from his belt. Not a standard Park Service tool, but a serious blade designed for field dressing large game. The steel reflected firelight as he tested the edge with his thumb. "I'm going to give you a 30-second head start," he continued with the same calm tone he might have used to discuss trail maintenance. "Then I'm going to track you down and show you what happens to rookie rangers who think their textbook knowledge makes them competent in real wilderness." "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm evolved. 3 years of living as nature intended, not hiding behind civilization's comfortable illusions." He smiled with genuine warmth that was more terrifying than anger would have been. "Run, Ranger Blackwood. Try to make it back to that safe little station house. Try to prove you deserve to wear that uniform." I ran. Behind me, I heard Ezra make a strangled sound of protest, but I couldn't help him by staying and getting myself killed. My only chance was reaching help and returning with proper backup. If backup existed, if my radio would work, if I could find my way out of terrain, he knew better than anyone. The forest had become a maze of shadows and obstacles designed to slow me down while giving him every advantage. Low branches caught my clothes and equipment, while roots and fallen logs threatened to send me sprawling with every step. The beam of my flashlight seemed pathetically weak against the overwhelming darkness, creating more confusion than illumination as it reflected off wet leaves and moss. Behind me, I could hear him moving through the same terrain with barely a sound. No crashing through underbrush or stumbling over obstacles. Just the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves to let me know he was back there, following at his own chosen pace. My lungs burned as I pushed through dense sections of forest where young trees had grown up thick as wheat. The thorny branches of Devil's Club tore at my jacket and caught my hair, while slick moss made every step treacherous. I was making enough noise to be heard for miles, advertising my location to a predator who could move through this environment like a ghost. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I had to stop. My heart hammered against my ribs while cold sweat made my uniform cling to my skin despite the October chill. I leaned against a massive cedar trunk and tried to calm my breathing enough to listen for pursuit. Silence. No footsteps, no breaking branches, no sound of movement at all. Just the perpetual drip of moisture from the canopy and my own ragged breathing echoing off the tree trunks around me. "Getting tired already?" His voice came from somewhere above me. I looked up to see Cray sitting casually on a thick branch about 15 feet overhead, having somehow climbed into position while I stumbled blindly through the underbrush below. He wasn't even breathing hard. Cardiovascular fitness was always the weak point in ranger training, he observed conversationally. Too much classroom time, not enough field conditioning. You city kids think an hour on a treadmill prepares you for real wilderness pursuit. I fumbled for my pepper spray, but he was already dropping from the branch with practiced agility. Before I could deploy the canister, his hand closed over my wrist with crushing force. "Not very sporting," he said, twisting until I dropped the spray. "Besides, chemical weapons don't work reliably in this humidity. The propellant gets moisture in the mechanism." His other hand closed around my throat, not tight enough to cut off air completely, but with enough pressure to make breathing difficult. Up close, I could smell the wood smoke and unwashed human scent that clung to his clothes, along with something metallic that might have been blood. "Your friend back at the fire is probably hypothermic by now," he continued in the same casual tone. "Young males don't handle exposure well, especially with trauma injuries. If you'd like him to see morning, I suggest we return and continue this lesson in a more controlled environment." The smart thing would have been to fight, to risk injury or death trying to escape rather than let him march me back to his torture site. But the possibility that Ezra might still be saved made me comply, as Cray forced me back through the forest toward his camp. He moved me efficiently through terrain that had seemed like a maze when I was running blind, game trails and natural corridors that I'd missed completely in my panic, shortcuts between ridges that saved time and energy. This was someone who had spent years learning every square mile of backcountry territory, turning it into his personal hunting ground. 15 years wearing this uniform," he said as we walked, keeping one hand on my shoulder while the other held his knife where I could see it. 15 years protecting wilderness areas from people who didn't respect them. Do you know what that taught me? I didn't answer, focusing on memorizing landmarks and potential escape routes. It taught me that humans are just another invasive species. We don't belong in places like this, pretending we can coexist with real wilderness. The only honest relationship between humans and nature is predator and prey. We emerged back into the firelight where Ezra still sat tied to his tree. The kid looked worse than before. His face was gray with cold and shock, while his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Hypothermia was definitely setting in, which meant he had maybe an hour before it became irreversible. "Look at him," Cray said, forcing me to my knees next to the fire. 19 years old, college student, probably never spent a night outdoors before this trip. Thought he could walk into 900,000 acres of old-growth forest and treat it like a photography studio. He tied my hands behind my back with practiced efficiency, using what looked like paracord from emergency hiking gear. The knots were professional, tight enough to cut off circulation if I struggled, but not so tight as to cause immediate injury. "You rangers enable this kind of arrogance," he continued, adding wood to the fire with deliberate care. "All your safety briefings and marked trails and emergency protocols make people think the wilderness is domesticated. Safe. Managed. We're trying to protect both people and the environment," I managed. "You're creating an illusion that gets people killed." His voice hardened with genuine anger. "Every year, dozens of unprepared idiots wander into backcountry areas thinking their GPS and cell phone make them invincible. When they get lost or injured or killed, who gets blamed? The Park Service, for not making the wilderness safe enough." He knelt beside Ezra and checked the kid's pulse with clinical detachment. "This one's going into shock. Probably has internal injuries from his lesson yesterday, but he's young and healthy, might survive long enough to learn something useful about respecting forces stronger than himself." "What do you want from us?" I asked. "I want you to understand what real rangers used to do before the service became a customer service organization." He stood and moved back to the fire, warming his hands like this was a normal camping trip. "We used to protect the wilderness from people, not for them. Sometimes that meant making hard choices about who belonged out here and who didn't." The implications of what he was saying made my stomach clench with fear. This wasn't random violence or even twisted entertainment. In his mind, he was still performing his ranger duties, just with methods that had evolved beyond official sanction. "You're talking about murder," I said. "I'm talking about natural selection. The wilderness doesn't care about human laws or social contracts. Out here, there's only predator and prey, survival and death. The strong teaching the weak their proper place in the food chain." He walked over to a cache hidden behind one of the large trees and returned with what looked like a modified Park Service radio. The device had extra antennas and electronic components that suggested he'd been monitoring and possibly jamming official communications for an extended period. "For 3 years, I've been providing real education about wilderness survival," he continued, adjusting dials on the radio until my voice came crackling through the speaker, recordings of my hourly check-ins with base station. "Your colleagues think you're conducting a routine search, finding normal signs of a lost hiker, gradually expanding your search grid according to established protocols. The recorded messages were perfect reproductions of standard radio procedures, but I hadn't made those calls. He'd been impersonating my voice, keeping park administration convinced that everything was proceeding normally while he isolated me in his hunting ground. Amazing how much you can learn about someone's speech patterns and vocabulary from personnel files and recorded training sessions, he said with professional satisfaction. 3 years of studying ranger protocols gives you quite an education in predictable behavior. Ezra made a weak sound that might have been my name. His eyes were losing focus as hypothermia progressed, but he was still trying to stay conscious. The kid had more fight than I'd given him credit for. He's dying, I said. Whatever point you're trying to make, he's already learned it. Let me treat his injuries. His education isn't complete yet. Neither is yours. Cray returned the radio to its hiding place and picked up his knife again. But we're making progress. An hour ago you still believed in rescue, in backup arriving, in civilization's safety net. Now you're starting to understand that none of those things exist out here. He was right. The growing realization that no help was coming, that I was completely alone with a predator who knew this terrain better than I knew my own apartment, made every shadow seem like a threat, and every sound like approaching death. So what happens now? I asked. Now you learn the final lesson, the one that separates real rangers from college graduates playing dress-up in the wilderness. He tested the knife edge again, drawing a thin line of blood from his thumb. You're going to choose who dies first. The words hit me like physical blows. What? Him or you. One of you is going to provide tonight's demonstration of what happens to people who don't respect predators. The other gets to carry that lesson back to civilization. His smile held no warmth at all. Choose wisely, Ranger Blackwood. Choose quickly. I looked at Ezra, whose eyes were still conscious enough to understand what was happening. The kid was 19 years old, probably had parents who were already calling park administration, wondering why their son hadn't checked in. He'd made the mistake of hiking alone in unfamiliar territory, but that didn't deserve a death sentence. On the other hand, I was trained for exactly these situations. My job was to protect park visitors, even at the cost of my own safety. If one of us had to die, it should be the professional who'd accepted that risk, not the civilian who'd just wanted to take some photographs. Me, I said quietly. Let him go and I'll stay. Touching, Cray observed. But that's not how natural selection works. The prey doesn't choose the order of consumption, the predator does. He moved toward Ezra with deliberate slowness, giving me time to understand what was about to happen and my complete inability to prevent it. The knife blade caught firelight as he knelt beside the kid and placed the edge against his throat. Last chance to run, Ranger Blackwood. See if 3 years of civilized training can get you back to that safe little station house before I finish with your friend here. I couldn't leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to save myself and bring back help that might arrive in time to find Ezra's remains and track down his killer. But I couldn't abandon someone I'd sworn to protect, even if staying meant dying uselessly. Good choice, Cray said approvingly, as I remained kneeling by the fire. Now, you're learning to think like a real ranger. Sometimes protecting people means accepting that you can't save everyone. The knife moved away from Ezra's throat, but I didn't feel relief. This was still part of his twisted education, another layer of psychological torture designed to break down civilized thinking and replace it with predator logic. But I lied, he continued conversationally. Neither of you is dying tonight. Not yet. Death is the end of education, and your lessons are just beginning. He cut the ropes holding Ezra to the tree, catching the kid before he could collapse. Despite his injuries and hypothermia, the college student was still conscious enough to understand he was being moved. We're going to take a little hike, Cray announced, slinging Ezra over his shoulder like a deer carcass. There's a place deeper in the forest where the real education happens, where your predecessor rangers learned their final lessons about who belongs in the wilderness and who doesn't. My blood turned to ice water. Predecessor rangers? Did you think you were the first Park Service employee to come looking for missing persons? The first to walk into my territory thinking your uniform and training made you competent to hunt human predators? His laugh echoed off the surrounding trees. Oh, Ranger Blackwood, You have so much still to learn." He gestured for me to stand, keeping his knife visible while Ezra's unconscious weight settled across his shoulders. Even carrying another human being, Cray moved through the forest with disturbing ease. "There's a place about 2 miles from here where the old-growth timber gives way to a natural clearing. Beautiful spot, really. Creek running through the middle, game trails converging from all directions. The kind of place early rangers would have used for base camps during extended patrols." We walked through darkness so complete that I had to stay close to Cray to avoid losing the trail entirely. Without my flashlight, which he'd taken and switched off, I was completely dependent on his knowledge of the terrain. Even if I'd wanted to run, the forest around us was an impenetrable maze. That's where I took Ranger Martinez when he came looking for those missing backpackers 2 years ago. 15-year veteran, search and rescue certified, confident he could handle anything the wilderness threw at him. Cray's voice held the fond remembrance of someone recalling a favorite hunting trip. He lasted 3 days before he understood his real place in the food chain. My mouth went dry as the implications became clear. "You killed Park Service personnel." "I educated them. Some education is necessarily fatal." He adjusted Ezra's weight and continued walking at the same steady pace. "Martinez thought his experience and training made him dangerous to someone like me. Took him most of those 3 days to realize that all his knowledge just made him more predictable." We crossed a stream by feeling our way across moss-slick stones in the darkness. The water was glacier cold and moved fast enough to drown someone who fell in while hypothermic. On the far side, Cray paused to let me catch up. Then there was Ranger Thompson, who came looking for Martinez. 22 years of service, tactical training, carried a sidearm because he suspected he might be dealing with something more dangerous than a missing person case. Another laugh, softer now. Poor old Thompson. Spent his whole career thinking weapons and procedures would protect him from real predators. "Where are they now?" I whispered. "Where all prey ends up eventually. Returned to the forest ecosystem, contributing to the natural cycle of death and decomposition that keeps places like this healthy." He resumed walking, forcing me to follow or be left behind in the darkness. Their remains helped fertilize some magnificent fungal blooms last spring. Even in death, they finally served a useful purpose in wilderness preservation. The casual way he discussed murdering fellow rangers made me understand that whatever sanity he'd possessed before coming out here had been completely eroded by 3 years of isolation and twisted logic. He wasn't just a killer, he was a serial killer who'd convinced himself that murder was environmental protection. "How many people?" I asked. "Counting Park Service personnel, 6 rangers over 3 years, plus perhaps 24 civilian visitors who needed to learn respect for forces beyond their understanding." He spoke with the pride of someone discussing professional accomplishments. Each one taught me something new about human behavior under extreme stress, about how quickly civilized people revert to animal desperation when they realize their society can't protect them. We reached the clearing he'd described, a natural meadow surrounded by ancient trees, with a stream meandering through grass that would have been knee-high in summer, but now lay flattened by autumn frost. Even in the darkness, I could sense the openness of the space, the way sound carried differently without the dense canopy overhead, the feeling of sky visible above us for the first time in hours. Cray deposited Ezra near what looked like the remains of an old campfire, then began gathering wood with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were casting dancing shadows across the clearing, revealing details that made my stomach clench with horror. Scattered around the meadow were pieces of equipment that had once belonged to other people. Backpacks hanging from tree branches, hiking boots arranged in neat rows, camping gear organized with military precision. But it was the smaller items that made the scene truly horrific. Personal belongings that told stories of lives cut short. A woman's wedding ring hanging from a string tied to a branch. A child's stuffed animal sitting upright against a tree trunk. Photographs of families pinned to bark like some twisted memorial display. "Welcome to the real ranger station," Cray announced, warming his hands over the new fire. "This is where the actual work of wilderness preservation gets done, where people learn their proper relationship with forces beyond their control." I forced myself to examine the grisly collection more carefully, looking for anything that might help me understand his methods, or find a weakness I could exploit. Among the hiking gear and personal effects, I recognized items that had clearly belonged to Park Service personnel. Radio equipment, GPS units, official patches torn from uniforms. Ranger Martinez's radio is still functional, Cray observed, following my gaze to a Park Service communication unit mounted on a makeshift antenna system. Amazing how long electronic equipment lasts when you maintain it properly. I've been using his call sign to monitor your department's communications for 2 years now. The implications were staggering. He wasn't just killing people in isolated incidents. He'd been conducting psychological warfare against the entire Park Service, using stolen equipment and murdered Rangers' identities to gather intelligence and plan future attacks. You've been impersonating dead Rangers, I said. I've been honoring their memory by continuing their real work, the work they should have been doing all along. He knelt beside Ezra and checked the kid's pulse again. This one's stabilizing. Cold shock followed by gradual warming. His body temperature is coming back up slowly enough to avoid cardiac complications. Despite everything, I felt a flutter of hope. If Ezra was surviving the hypothermia, there was still a chance both of us might live through this nightmare. Don't mistake medical care for mercy, Cray continued, apparently reading my expression. I need him conscious for the final phase of his education. Pain and fear are more instructive when the subject is fully aware of what's happening to them. He moved to one of the backpacks hanging from the trees and withdrew what looked like a first aid kit. But when he opened it, the contents weren't bandages and antiseptic. They were surgical instruments, restraints, and bottles of chemicals I couldn't identify. 3 years of field research into human psychology under extreme stress, he explained, laying out the instruments with clinical precision. Amazing what you can learn about survival instincts when you remove all the comfortable illusions of civilization. My training had covered hostage situations and dealing with mentally unstable individuals, but nothing had prepared me for someone who combined professional wilderness skills with complete sociopathic detachment. Every attempt at negotiation or de-escalation would be useless against someone who'd spent years perfecting his hunting techniques on human prey. What do you want from us? I asked again, still hoping to find some leverage for bargaining. I want you to understand what your job really is, he replied, testing the edge of a scalpel against his thumb. For too long, the Park Service has been protecting people from the wilderness instead of protecting the wilderness from people. That fundamental misunderstanding has led to the degradation of sacred places by hordes of unprepared tourists who think nature exists for their entertainment. He gestured toward the collection of personal belongings scattered around the clearing. Each of these people thought they belonged out here, thought their GPS and emergency beacons and cell phones made them safe in environments that have been killing humans for millions of years. They needed to learn humility. By torturing and murdering them, by teaching them the same lessons our ancestors learned the hard way, that humans are not the dominant species they pretend to be, that there are still places on Earth where we exist only at the sufferance of forces beyond our control. His voice took on the fervor of someone discussing religious doctrine. These people died understanding their true place in the natural order. That's more wisdom than most humans achieve in entire lifetimes of civilized delusion. Ezra stirred beside the fire, consciousness returning as his body temperature normalized. The kid's eyes focused on me with desperate hope that I might have some plan for getting us out of this situation. I tried to project confidence I didn't feel while looking for any opportunity to improve our chances. You're awake, Cray observed pleasantly, kneeling beside Ezra with paternal concern. How are you feeling? Any numbness in your extremities? Difficulty breathing? The juxtaposition of medical care and sadistic threat was more disturbing than outright violence would have been. This wasn't random brutality. It was calculated psychological torture designed to maximize terror and despair. Please, Ezra whispered, his voice barely audible. I just wanted to take some pictures. Of course you did. And now you have a much more dramatic story to tell than anything you could have captured with that expensive camera equipment. Cray's smile held genuine warmth that made his words even more chilling. Assuming you survive long enough to tell it. He stood and walked back to his collection of surgical instruments, selecting items with the care of someone planning a complex procedure. Ranger Blackwood, you're going to assist with tonight's educational demonstration. Consider it advanced training in wilderness medicine. I won't help you torture anyone, I said. Yes, you will. Because the alternative is watching me work on him without anesthetic or antiseptic, drawing out his education over several days instead of completing it quickly tonight. He held up a syringe filled with clear liquid. Local anesthetic. Not enough to prevent pain entirely, but sufficient to prevent shock-induced unconsciousness. Your choice whether he receives it or not. The impossible decision was exactly what he wanted, forcing me to become complicit in torture while believing I was minimizing suffering. Every choice would make me responsible for escalating or prolonging Ezra's pain. Don't do this, Ezra pleaded, looking between us with the desperate hope of someone who still believed adults might protect him. I'll leave. I'll never come back to the park. I'll tell everyone it's too dangerous. Oh, you'll definitely tell everyone that, Cray agreed cheerfully. The question is whether you'll be in any condition to make the story credible. Survivors with obvious trauma tend to be more persuasive than people who just describe theoretical dangers. He approached Ezra with the syringe moving with the calm efficiency of a medical professional. This might sting a little. Try to hold still. I lunged forward, trying to knock the needle away from Ezra's arm, but Cray was ready for the movement. His free hand caught my wrist and twisted until I dropped to my knees beside the fire, joints screaming with pain. Predictable, he observed, maintaining the hold while injecting Ezra with clinical precision. Rookie rangers always think they can resolve situations through direct action. Experience teaches you to wait for better opportunities. The anesthetic took effect quickly, leaving Ezra conscious but unable to feel sensation in his left arm. Cray tested the numbness by pricking the skin with his scalpel, drawing blood without eliciting any reaction from his victim. Perfect. We can begin the real education now. He looked at me with expectant enthusiasm. Your first lesson in advanced wilderness medicine, field amputation. Useful skill when someone suffers severe trauma miles from proper medical facilities. You're insane, I whispered. I'm practical. In 3 years of living out here, I've learned that human bodies are remarkably adaptable when necessity demands it. People can survive injuries that would seem fatal in comfortable hospital settings. He positioned the scalpel just above Ezra's wrist. The question is whether you're going to assist with proper technique or watch me improvise. Ezra looked at me with eyes that held no hope anymore. Just the numb acceptance of someone who understood he was going to die horribly, no matter what anyone did. The kid was 19 years old and already broken by terror into something that barely resembled human consciousness. I couldn't let that happen. Not to him, not while I was still alive to prevent it. I'll help, I said quietly. Just make it quick. Now you're thinking like a real ranger, Cray approved. Sometimes protection means accepting that you can't save everyone intact. He handed me a tourniquet and directed me to position it above Ezra's elbow while he prepared his cutting instruments. The procedure was horribly professional. He'd clearly done this before, possibly many times, and refined his technique through repetition. But as I tightened the tourniquet around Ezra's arm, I noticed something that gave me a flicker of hope. Cray's concentration on his surgical preparation made him momentarily less aware of my other movements. The fire poker he'd used to adjust the burning logs lay within reach of my free hand. Excellent technique, he murmured, testing the blade one final time. You might actually have potential for this kind of work if you can overcome your squeamishness about necessary procedures. I grabbed the poker and swung it at his head with every ounce of strength I possessed. The iron bar caught him just above the left ear with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon. Cray toppled sideways into the fire, scattering burning logs and sending sparks cascading across the clearing. He wasn't unconscious. Head injuries that don't cause immediate loss of consciousness rarely do. But he was dazed enough for me to grab his knife and cut the ropes binding Ezra to the tree. The kid was still groggy from whatever drug had been in that syringe, but alert enough to understand we were escaping. Can you walk? I asked, hauling him to his feet. I think so. His voice was slurred but determined. My arm feels weird, but my legs work. Behind us, Cray was struggling to extract himself from the scattered fire, his clothes smoldering where they'd contacted burning coals. The head wound was bleeding freely, but he was already regaining coordination, and would be mobile within seconds. "Run," I told Ezra, pushing him toward what I hoped was the trail leading back toward civilization. "Follow the creek downstream. It has to lead toward the main river eventually. What about you? I'll be right behind you, go." Ezra stumbled away into the darkness while I looked for anything useful among Cray's equipment cache. The stolen Park Service radio was too heavy to carry while running, but I grabbed a flashlight and what looked like emergency flares from one of the backpacks. "Clever girl," Cray called from behind me, his voice thick with blood but still functional. "Using my momentary distraction to create a tactical advantage." "Very good." I turned to see him standing beside the scattered fire, one hand pressed against his bleeding head, while the other held a hunting rifle I hadn't noticed before. Even injured, he moved with predatory grace. "But you're still thinking like prey," he continued, raising the weapon to track my movement. "Prey runs when confronted. Predators pursue." The rifle shot shattered the night silence, sending birds exploding from trees throughout the clearing. I felt the bullet pass close enough to my ear that the displacement of air was like a physical slap. I dove into the forest undergrowth as the second shot splintered bark from a tree just above my head. Behind me I could hear Cray laughing with genuine delight. "Much better," he called. "Now you're learning to think like something worth hunting." The forest closed around me like a living maze designed to slow my escape while giving him every advantage. Low branches caught my clothing and equipment, while roots and fallen logs threatened to send me sprawling with every step. The flashlight beam seemed pathetically weak against the overwhelming darkness, but I had one advantage he might not have anticipated: genuine desperation. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't trying to follow protocols or maintain professional composure. I was running for my life with the single-minded intensity of someone who finally understood the stakes. A third rifle shot echoed through the trees, though I couldn't tell where the bullet had gone. Cray was following me but taking time to aim carefully, which suggested he was treating this as sport rather than urgent pursuit. In his mind, I was already trapped in his hunting ground with no real chance of escape. I reached the creek and followed it downstream, hoping Ezra had the sense to stay ahead of me and keep moving toward the main drainage. The water was only knee-deep, but moved fast enough over slick stones that falling would mean hypothermia within minutes. "Ranger Blackwood," Cray's voice carried clearly over the sound of running water. "You're only making this harder on yourself, and on your young friend." The threat to Ezra made me stumble and nearly fall into the creek. If Cray caught up with us, he'd take his frustration about my resistance out on the kid. Whatever he'd planned to do to Ezra in that clearing would be nothing compared to what he'd do if he recaptured us both. I had to end this. Not escape, not survive until help arrived, but actually stop him permanently. He was wounded, possibly concussed, and I had his knife plus the advantage of desperation. If I could ambush him somewhere along the creek, I might be able to finish what the fire poker had started. The plan was suicidal. He had military training, wilderness expertise, and a rifle, while I had 8 months of ranger experience and a hunting knife. But it was the only chance either Ezra or I had of seeing another sunrise. I found what I was looking for about a quarter-mile downstream, a section where the creek curved sharply around a fallen log, creating a natural choke point that would force him to approach from a predictable direction. I could hide in the undergrowth on the far side and attack when he came around the bend. The wait felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I lay pressed against the mossy ground behind a screen of ferns, knife gripped in both hands, trying to control my breathing enough to hear his approach over the creek noise. When he appeared, moving along the water's edge with predatory patience, I understood why previous rangers had died trying to fight him. Even wounded and tracking in darkness, he moved through the forest like he'd been born there. The rifle was held ready but not raised, suggesting confidence that his prey was too panicked for effective resistance. I waited until he was directly opposite my hiding place before attacking. The knife caught him in the side, sliding between ribs with resistance I hadn't expected. He grunted with pain but managed to bring the rifle stock around in a sweeping blow that caught me across the face and sent me sprawling into the creek. The glacial water was a shock that cleared my head and washed blood from what felt like a broken nose. Cray stood over me, rifle aimed at my chest, his face showing respect I hadn't seen before. Outstanding, he said approvingly, finally thinking like a predator instead of prey. That was a genuinely good ambush. Blood was spreading across his shirt from where the knife had penetrated, but he seemed more pleased than concerned about the wound. You might actually have survived out here if you'd received proper training instead of that academic nonsense they teach rookies. Let Ezra go, I managed through the blood flowing from my nose. You've got what you wanted. What I wanted was to complete both your educations, his about the realities of wilderness survival, yours about what it really means to protect people in environments like this. He kept the rifle trained on me while examining his wound. But you've demonstrated more potential than I expected. Perhaps there's value in extending the lesson. The water around me was already numbing my legs, while blood from my nose made it difficult to breathe properly. If I stayed in the creek much longer, hypothermia would finish what Cray had started. Get out slowly, he directed. Keep your hands where I can see them. I climbed out of the water on unsteady legs, trying to assess my injuries while looking for any opportunity to continue fighting. The knife thrust had been deep enough to cause real damage, but Cray showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, being wounded seemed to have energized him. You're learning the most important lesson any ranger can master, he continued, using the rifle to gesture me away from the creek. Sometimes protecting people means accepting that you can't save everyone. Sometimes it means making hard choices about who deserves to survive and who doesn't. Ezra deserves to live, I said. He's 19 years old. He made a mistake, but that doesn't justify murder. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether they learn from them or repeat them until natural selection removes them from the gene pool. He smiled with paternal warmth. Your friend has learned more about wilderness survival in 2 days than most people learn in lifetimes of comfortable ignorance. We walked back toward his clearing camp, with him staying far enough behind that I couldn't attempt another attack. The wound in his side was still bleeding, but not heavily enough to incapacitate him quickly. Where do you think he went? Cray asked conversationally. Away from you. Downstream, following the creek like you told him to. Reasonable strategy for someone without wilderness experience, but predictable. The creek leads to Clearwater Falls, which drops about 60 feet into a pool that's impossible to climb out of without proper equipment. His laugh echoed through the trees. Your rescue attempt just drove him into a natural trap. The realization hit me like a physical blow. In my panic to get Ezra away from immediate danger, I'd sent him directly toward a geographic dead end where Cray could corner him easily. Don't blame yourself, he continued with genuine sympathy. You made the best decision available with limited information. That's what separates experienced rangers from rookies. We learn to think several moves ahead. We reached the clearing where his gruesome collection of trophies surrounded the smoldering remains of our escape fire. Everything looked exactly as we'd left it, except for the obvious signs of our brief fight and the blood trail leading away into the forest. Sit, he directed, indicating a spot near the rebuilt fire. We're going to wait for your friend to realize he's trapped and come back looking for help. He won't come back. He will, because he's 19 years old and still believes in rescue, in adults who can solve problems he can't handle himself. When he reaches those falls and understands he can't go any further, his first instinct will be to return and find the competent adult who tried to save him. Cray was probably right. Ezra was a college kid who'd never faced anything more dangerous than midterm exams. Confronted with what seemed like certain death at the base of a waterfall, he'd likely convince himself that returning to find me was his only chance of survival. That's when his real education begins, Cray continued, settling down across the fire from me with the rifle across his knees. When he has to choose between abandoning someone who tried to help him and walking back into obvious danger to attempt a rescue, he's not qualified to perform. The twisted logic was perfect in its cruelty. Either Ezra would abandon me and live with that guilt forever, or he'd return and deliver himself back to Cray's hands. There was no choice that didn't result in psychological destruction. You've done this before, I realized. Variations on the theme. Amazing how consistently people react when you understand their fundamental psychology. He added wood to the fire with practiced efficiency. The protective instinct is both humanity's greatest strength and its most exploitable weakness. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, listening to forest sounds and waiting for Ezra's inevitable return. The fire crackled between us while Cray cleaned and bandaged his wound with supplies from his medical kit. The knife thrust had been serious but not fatal, enough to slow him down but not enough to end the threat he represented. "Tell me about the other Rangers," I said finally. "What would you like to know? How they died? Whether they fought back? Whether any of them came close to stopping you?" His smile showed genuine fondness for the memories. Martinez lasted the longest. 15 years of experience made him resourceful in ways I hadn't anticipated. He actually managed to evade me for 3 days, using techniques I hadn't seen since my military training. But you caught him. Eventually. Experience can't overcome superior knowledge of terrain and unlimited time for pursuit. He made the mistake of trying to signal for help instead of focusing entirely on escape. Cray's eyes reflected firelight as he remembered. Thompson was more direct. 22 years of service had taught him that sometimes you have to fight your way out of impossible situations. And he put up an excellent fight. Military training, tactical awareness, proper use of available weapons. Under different circumstances, he might have been successful. The fond tone never changed. But he was operating in my territory, with equipment I'd sabotaged, following patterns I'd studied for months. The casual way he discussed murdering fellow Rangers made me understand that whatever humanity he'd possessed before coming out here had been completely consumed by 3 years of isolation and predatory behavior. "What about the visitors? The civilians you killed?" They taught me different lessons, about human psychology under extreme stress, about the breakdown of civilized behavior when survival instincts take over. He adjusted the rifle across his lap without taking his eyes off me. Amazing how quickly people abandon moral principles when they're genuinely threatened. A sound from the forest made both of us freeze, branches breaking, footsteps trying to move quietly through dense undergrowth. Someone was approaching the clearing, attempting stealth but lacking the skill to move silently in this terrain. "Right on schedule," Cray murmured, raising the rifle to a ready position. "Your friend has realized he can't escape downstream and return to attempt a rescue he's not qualified to perform." "Ezra, run!" I shouted toward the forest. "Don't come back here." The footsteps stopped, followed by a long silence that stretched until my nerves felt like wire being twisted to the breaking point. Then Ezra's voice called out from the darkness beyond the firelight. "Kendra, are you okay?" "I'm alive," I called back. "But he's got a rifle. You need to get out of here and find help." "There's nowhere to go," Ezra replied, sounding exhausted and defeated. "The creek ends at a waterfall. I can't climb down, and I can't find any other trails in the dark." "Then hide," I pleaded. "Wait for daylight. Someone will come looking for us eventually." "Excellent advice," Cray called toward the forest, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone used to managing dangerous situations. But unfortunately, Ranger's Blackwood is bleeding internally from her injuries. Without medical attention within the next few hours, she's going to die regardless of what you do. The lie was perfectly calculated to exploit Ezra's protective instincts. He was 19 years old, barely an adult, suddenly responsible for decisions that would determine whether someone who'd tried to save him lived or died. "He's lying," I shouted. "I'm fine. Get away from here." "Actually, I'm being completely honest," Cray replied calmly. "Check her nose, son. Look at how she's holding her ribs. Those are symptoms of serious internal trauma that requires immediate evacuation to proper medical facilities." I touched my face and felt fresh blood that hadn't been there before. The rifle stock blow had done more damage than I'd realized, while my ribs ached in a way that suggested possible fractures from being thrown into the creek. "Kendra." Ezra's voice was closer now, moving through the forest toward our clearing despite every rational reason to flee. "Don't," I whispered, but it was already too late. Ezra stepped into the firelight with his hands raised, looking between Cray and me with the desperate hope of someone who still believed adults could solve problems beyond his understanding. "Let her go," he said quietly. "I'll stay. I'll do whatever you want. Just let her get medical help." Touching, Cray observed approvingly. And exactly the response I predicted. The protective instinct overriding survival logic. He gestured for Ezra to sit beside the fire. Unfortunately, you're not in a position to negotiate terms. Neither of you is leaving here tonight. Then what do you want? I want you both to understand what your job really is, Cray replied, exactly as he had hours earlier. Ranger Blackwood thinks her duty is to protect visitors like you from wilderness dangers. You think the Park Service exists to make places like this safe for recreational use? He stood and moved to his collection of surgical instruments, selecting items with the same clinical care he'd shown before. Both perspectives represent fundamental misunderstandings about the relationship between humans and environments that don't care whether we live or die. So you're going to torture us to death to make some philosophical point? I asked. I'm going to complete your education by demonstrating what happens when humans encounter forces genuinely beyond their control. Forces that can't be negotiated with, appealed to, or defeated through teamwork and determination. His smile held paternal warmth that made his words even more chilling. Most people die without ever learning that lesson. You two are fortunate enough to receive advanced instruction. Ezra looked at me with eyes that still held hope I might have some plan for getting us out of this situation. The kid was 19 years old and had probably never encountered genuine malice before this nightmare began. Listen to me carefully, I told him. Whatever happens, don't give him what he wants. Don't break down, don't beg, don't let him see that you're afraid. Excellent advice, Cray agreed cheerfully. Maintaining dignity in the face of overwhelming force is one of humanity's most admirable qualities. Almost makes our species seem worth preserving. He approached Ezra with a syringe filled with the same clear liquid he'd used before. This will prevent shock-induced unconsciousness without eliminating pain entirely. Think of it as a learning aid. Don't touch him, I said, struggling to my feet despite the pain in my ribs. Sit down, Ranger Blackwood. Your turn comes next. The rifle swung toward me with casual precision. Unless you'd prefer to watch him die quickly instead of learning something useful about human psychology under extreme stress. The impossible choice was exactly what he wanted, forcing me to become complicit in torture while believing I was minimizing suffering. Every decision would make me responsible for escalating or prolonging both our deaths. But as Cray knelt beside Ezra with the needle, I realized something that gave me a flicker of hope. The head wound I'd inflicted was affecting his coordination more than he was letting on. His movements were slightly slower, his balance not quite perfect. If I could create another distraction at exactly the right moment, I might be able to complete what the fire poker had started. I waited until the syringe was positioned against Ezra's arm, then lunged forward with everything I had left. This time, I went for his throat. My fingers found his windpipe before he could react, squeezing with desperate strength while his hands clawed at my face. We crashed into the fire together, scattering burning logs across the clearing as we rolled in combat that was more animal than human. He was stronger, but the head injury had affected his balance enough to give me a fighting chance. I maintained my grip on his throat while his fingernails tore furrows down my cheeks, both of us grunting and gasping as we fought for position among the scattered coals. Then his knee caught me in the stomach with enough force to double me over, gasping for breath. His hands closed around my throat in return, squeezing until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. Enough, he wheezed, blood running from his nose where I'd managed to connect with my elbow. Enough games. He hauled me upright and shoved me back toward the fire, keeping one hand on my throat while reaching for the rifle with the other. I could see Ezra watching with horrified fascination as two adults tried to kill each other with their bare hands. You fight better than most, Cray observed, checking that the rifle was still functional after our roll through the flames. But you're still thinking like prey. Predators don't fight fair. They use every available advantage. He pointed the weapon at Ezra's head. Now sit down and behave yourself, or I'll show you what his brains look like splattered across these trees. I sat, defeated. Every time I'd tried to resist, he'd simply escalated the threat to Ezra. The kid was my weakness, and Cray exploited it with professional efficiency. Much better. He wiped blood from his face while keeping the rifle trained on us. Now, where were we? Oh, yes. Advanced education and wilderness survival. He returned to his surgical instruments, selecting a scalpel that caught firelight along its blade. Ranger Blackwood, you're going to assist with tonight's demonstration. Consider it field training in emergency medicine. I won't help you torture anyone. Yes, you will, because the alternative is watching me work without anesthetic, drawing out his education over several days instead of completing it quickly tonight. He held up another syringe. Your choice, and the same impossible decision as before, forcing me to become complicit while believing I was minimizing suffering. But this time, I understood what he was really doing, not just torturing us physically, but destroying our humanity by making us participate in our own destruction. Do it yourself, I said quietly. His eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. Interesting. You're choosing to let him suffer longer rather than compromise your moral principles. Most people break sooner than this. Most people haven't spent 8 months learning what real rangers are supposed to protect. And what's that, in your expert opinion? Each other, I replied, looking directly at Ezra. We protect each other, even when it costs us everything. For the first time since this nightmare began, Cray's expression showed something that wasn't calm confidence. My refusal to participate had disrupted his script, forced him to confront the possibility that his psychological manipulation wasn't as effective as he'd believed. Touching sentiment, he said finally, but ultimately irrelevant. You'll participate eventually, or you'll watch him die slowly while listening to him beg you to help end his suffering. He knelt beside Ezra with the scalpel, positioning it just above the kid's left wrist. Last chance, Ranger Blackwood. Assist with proper technique or watch me improvise. The blade pressed against skin until blood began to well around its edges. Ezra bit his lip but didn't make a sound, staring at me with trust that I didn't deserve. Stop, I whispered. Then help. I looked at the kid. 19 years old, probably had parents who were already calling park administration wondering why their son hadn't checked in, and made the hardest decision of my life. No. The scalpel moved deeper and Ezra finally screamed. What followed next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Not just the physical torture, but the sound of Cray's clinical commentary as he worked. The educational observations about human pain tolerance and psychological breaking points. The way he documented every response as if conducting legitimate research. But the worst part was watching Ezra's eyes throughout the ordeal. The kid never looked at Cray, never begged him to stop. He kept his gaze fixed on me, drawing strength from someone who was failing to protect him in every way that mattered. It lasted 47 minutes. I know because I watched my digital watch the entire time, counting down seconds and minutes while promising myself I wouldn't break, wouldn't give Cray the satisfaction of making me complicit in torture. When Ezra finally lost consciousness from blood loss and shock, Cray sat back with the satisfied expression of someone who had completed important work. Disappointing, he observed, cleaning his instruments with methodical care. I expected him to last longer than that. Young males usually have better pain tolerance. You killed him, I whispered. Not yet, but soon. He checked Ezra's pulse with clinical detachment. Loss of consciousness indicates the body is shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core organ function. He has perhaps 20 minutes before irreversible damage occurs. He stood and moved toward me with a fresh syringe. Your turn, Ranger Blackwood. Let's see if 8 months of professional training has given you better survival instincts than a 19-year-old college student. The needle slid into my arm before I could resist, filling my bloodstream with whatever mixture of chemicals he'd perfected over 3 years of human experimentation. Almost immediately, I felt my thinking become sluggish while physical sensations seemed to intensify. Combination of local anesthetic and mild stimulant, he explained conversationally. Prevents shock-induced unconsciousness while heightening pain reception. One of my own formulations, refined through extensive field testing. The scalpel moved toward my hand, and I understood that I was about to experience exactly what Ezra had endured. The only difference was that I would remain conscious longer, providing Cray with better data for his twisted research. But as the blade touched my skin, drawing the first thin line of blood, something impossible happened. Gunshots echoed through the forest, not the single crack of Cray's rifle, but the rapid succession of automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Olympic County Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapons and show your hands. The voice carried clearly through the trees, amplified by electronic bullhorn and backed by the sound of vehicles approaching through the forest. Powerful searchlights swept across the clearing, turning night into blazing day. Cray's expression showed genuine shock for the first time since this nightmare began. Impossible. I've been monitoring all Park Service communications. No one knows this location. The searchlights grew brighter as tactical teams moved through the forest with professional efficiency. I could hear radio chatter coordinating positions, the mechanical sounds of equipment being deployed, boots moving through undergrowth with the disciplined spacing of trained personnel. Satellite tracking. I managed through the fog of whatever drug he'd injected. Emergency GPS beacon in my equipment belt. Automatic activation if I don't check in every 4 hours. It was a lie. No such technology existed in standard Ranger equipment. But Cray's 3 years of isolation had left gaps in his knowledge of current procedures and capabilities. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty flickered across his features. "New protocol since Ranger Martinez disappeared," I continued, trying to keep him talking while help surrounded our position. "Automatic tracking for all solo operations in backcountry areas." The lie worked because it should have been true. After losing multiple Rangers to unknown threats, any competent administration would have implemented better tracking systems. Cray's paranoia about Park Service procedures made him believe in capabilities that didn't actually exist. "Drop the weapon. This is your final warning." The voice was close enough now that I could see tactical officers positioned at the edge of the clearing, assault rifles trained on our position. Professional law enforcement, not Park Service personnel trying to handle a situation beyond their training. Cray looked at the scalpel in his hand, then at me, then at the unconscious form of Ezra beside the dying fire. For a moment, I thought he might surrender, accept capture rather than die in a futile firefight against overwhelming force. Instead, he smiled with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Ranger Blackwood. You've provided an excellent education in advanced tactical psychology." He reversed his grip on the scalpel, holding it like a weapon instead of a surgical instrument. "One final lesson about the difference between civilization and wilderness." He moved toward Ezra's unconscious form, and I understood with horrible clarity what he intended. Not surrender, not escape, but one final demonstration of power over forces beyond his victim's control. I threw myself between Cray and Ezra just as the tactical teams opened fire. The gunshots were deafening in the confined space of the clearing, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning while bullets tore through air where Cray had been standing. But he was already moving, using 3 years of wilderness survival skills to exploit every shadow and tree trunk for cover. I felt something hot and wet splash across my face, blood from where a bullet had grazed Cray's shoulder. But he was still mobile, still dangerous. The scalpel gleamed in his uninjured hand as he circled toward where Ezra lay helpless beside the scattered fire. "Don't let him reach the kid," I screamed, trying to make myself heard over the gunfire and radio chatter. More shots, more muzzle flashes, the sharp crack of bullets splintering bark from ancient trees. But Cray moved through the chaos like a ghost, exploiting every irregularity in terrain that 3 years of living rough had taught him to recognize. He reached Ezra and knelt beside the unconscious college student, scalpel poised over the kid's throat. "Stand down," he called to the tactical officers. One step closer and I open his carotid artery. The gunfire stopped, leaving sudden silence that felt more ominous than the violence had been. I could see rifle scopes glinting in the searchlight beams, professional marksmen waiting for clean shots that wouldn't endanger the hostage. "Let him go," a calm voice called from the darkness beyond the lights. "We can negotiate terms that get everyone out of here safely." "No negotiation," Cray replied cheerfully. "Just education. These people need to understand what happens when civilized assumptions meet wilderness realities." The scalpel pressed against Ezra's skin, drawing a thin line of blood that looked black in the harsh artificial lighting. The kid stirred slightly, consciousness returning at the worst possible moment. Final lesson, Ranger Blackwood. Cray continued, his voice carrying the same warm authority he'd used throughout this nightmare. Sometimes protection means accepting that you can't save everyone intact. I knew he was going to kill Ezra regardless of what anyone did. This wasn't negotiation. It was the final phase of whatever twisted education he'd been conducting. The tactical teams were irrelevant. He'd already decided how this would end. But I also knew something else. The drug he'd injected was wearing off, leaving me clear-headed for the first time in hours. And among all his surgical instruments scattered around the fire, one item lay within reach of my bound hands. Another scalpel, forgotten in the chaos of the tactical team's arrival. I worked my fingers behind my back until they closed around the handle, then began sawing through the ropes binding my wrists. The blade was sharp enough to part the fibers quickly, though it also opened several cuts in my hands before I could adjust my grip properly. "Don't do this," I said aloud, trying to keep Cray's attention while I freed myself. "You've made your point. We understand what you wanted to teach us. Do you? Do you really understand that humans are just another species subject to predation by superior forces?" His smile showed genuine fondness. "Or are you still hoping that civilization's safety net will somehow save you from natural consequences?" The ropes parted, just as Ezra's eyes opened, consciousness returning to find a blade at his throat, and searchlights turning the forest clearing into a theater of violence. "Don't move," Cray told the kid softly. "This will be over soon." I lunged forward with the scalpel, aiming for the center of mass like they'd taught us in defensive tactics training. But Cray had been expecting the attack. He deliberately left the blade within reach, wanting to see if I'd learned to think like a predator instead of prey. His free hand caught my wrist before the scalpel could connect, twisting until bones ground together and I dropped the weapon. Very good. Finally thinking like something worth hunting. We grappled beside the dying fire while tactical officers tried to find shots that wouldn't hit either of us. Cray was stronger and far more experienced in hand-to-hand combat, but 3 years of living rough had also left him gaunt and malnourished. I had youth and desperation on my side. More importantly, I had 8 months of professional training that finally kicked in when survival instincts overrode civilized inhibitions. I got my thumb into his wounded eye socket and pressed until he screamed. Cray released his grip on my wrist and stumbled backward, blood streaming down his face from the damaged socket. The scalpel intended for Ezra's throat clattered away across the forest floor. "Now!" I shouted to the tactical teams. "Take the shot!" The sniper's bullet took Cray in the center of his chest, spinning him around before he collapsed beside the scattered coals of his torture fire. He lay on his back among the personal belongings of his victims, staring up at the forest canopy with the surprised expression of someone who'd finally encountered a force beyond his control. But he was still breathing. "Ranger. Blackwood," he wheezed, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "Come. Closer." I knelt beside him while tactical medics worked to stabilize Ezra's condition. Whatever Cray wanted to say, I owed it to his other victims to hear his final words. "You learned," he whispered. Finally, thinking like predator. "I learned that some people don't deserve to live," I replied. "Everyone deserves education." His ruined smile held the same warmth it had throughout this nightmare. "Even you." "What education?" "Look around. All these people came to save you." He gestured weakly toward the tactical officers securing the clearing. "Civilization's safety net worked exactly like you believed." The words hit me like a physical blow. Even dying, he was still conducting his twisted lessons. But next time, deeper. Wilderness. No satellites. No backup. Just you and forces beyond control. Blood ran from his mouth as he spoke. "Remember this feeling when you're truly alone." Matthias Cray died with that same fond smile, surrounded by the evidence of 3 years spent teaching people that civilization was just a comfortable illusion that failed when they needed it most. The tactical teams extracted us from the forest using procedures I'd only read about in training manuals. Helicopter evacuation, trauma medical protocols, crime scene preservation. Everything worked exactly as it was supposed to, proving that civilization's safety net was more robust than Cray had claimed. Ezra survived. Emergency surgery repaired most of the damage, though he'd carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. The kid transferred to a different college as far from Olympic National Park as he could manage, but he sent me a letter 6 months later saying that surviving had taught him something important about his own strength. I resigned from the Park Service 3 weeks after my medical leave ended. Not because of trauma or inability to function, but because Cray's final lesson had been more effective than he'd known. Every time I looked at the forest, I saw not the natural beauty I'd sworn to protect, but a hunting ground where humans existed only at the sufferance of forces beyond their control. More importantly, I'd learned something about myself during those hours in his clearing. When survival was at stake, when civilization's safety net seemed to have failed, I'd been capable of violence that had nothing to do with law enforcement or professional duty. I'd pressed my thumb into another human being's eye socket and felt satisfaction when he screamed. Cray had been right about one thing. We're all just animals pretending that moral principles matter more than survival instincts. The difference between civilization and wilderness isn't as wide as we'd like to believe. I work private security now, mostly corporate clients who want someone with tactical training and wilderness experience. The money is better than government service, and I don't have to pretend that I'm protecting anything more noble than profit margins. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I find myself thinking about that clearing in Olympic National Park, about the personal belongings of people who died learning that the wilderness doesn't care about human assumptions, about Rangers Martinez and Thompson, who'd carried the same professional confidence I'd once possessed, and about Matthias Cray's final words, promising that someday I'd find myself in deeper wilderness, with no satellites and no backup, facing forces beyond my control. I check my equipment twice before every assignment now. I carry backup communications gear, emergency beacons, and weapons that aren't standard issue for civilian security work. I've taken advanced survival training and tactical courses that go far beyond what the Park Service required. Because I know he was right about one thing. There are still places on Earth where civilization's safety net doesn't reach. Places where humans are just another species subject to predation by superior forces. And I know that someday, despite all my preparations, I'm going to find myself in one of those places. When that happens, I want to be ready to think like a predator instead of prey. Because the most important lesson Matthias Cray taught me wasn't about the weakness of civilization or the illusion of safety. It was about the difference between people who survive and people who don't. The survivors are the ones who understand that when everything else fails, we're still just animals fighting for our lives in a world that doesn't care whether we live or die. And sometimes that understanding is the only thing that keeps us breathing long enough to see another sunrise. My name is Kendra Blackwood, and I survived my education in wilderness predation. But I know the lessons aren't over yet. They never are. My name is Cooper Blackwood, and I am 28 years old. I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 6 years. This happened during the fall of 2023, when the missing person case of Ambrose Kellerman turned into something that still haunts me. I should have known something was wrong when the ravens started leaving. October 15th began like any other autumn morning in the Hoh River Valley. The fog hung thick between the ancient Sitka spruces, muffling sound and turning the world into a cathedral of green shadows. I'd been working the temperate rainforest section for 3 years, and I knew its moods better than most. But that morning, something felt off. The usual chorus of wrens and thrushes was absent. Even the Douglas squirrels had gone quiet. My radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m. Ranger station to Blackwood. We've got a missing person report. Copy? Blackwood here. Go ahead, dispatch. 34-year-old male Ambrose Kellerman, mycologist from University of Washington. Last seen yesterday evening, approximately 1800 hours near the Saul Duke Trail Junction. Vehicle still in parking area. Overnight camping permit valid through today. I grabbed my field notebook, already mentally mapping the search area. The Saul Duke Junction was tricky territory. multiple trail branches, steep ravines, and dense undergrowth that could swallow a person whole. Copy. Any medical conditions or previous experience in the backcountry? Extensive fieldwork experience, no known medical issues. Family reports he was studying rare fungi species, something about seasonal fruiting patterns. His research partner says Kellerman was excited about a specimen cluster he'd located off-trail. Off-trail. That complicated things. ETA for search teams? You're primary on scene. Backup team inbound from Port Angeles. ETA Aero 900 hours. Weather forecast shows increasing fog and possible precipitation. I signed off and began loading my pack. 6 years of experience had taught me to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. GPS unit, extra batteries, first aid kit, emergency shelter, rope, headlamp, and my .40 caliber sidearm. Standard issue for dealing with aggressive wildlife. The weight felt familiar across my shoulders as I headed into the mist. The Sol Duke Trailhead parking lot held only Kellerman's Honda Civic, its windshield beaded with condensation. I circled the vehicle, noting the University of Washington parking sticker, and peering through the windows. The back seat contained camping gear neatly organized: sleeping bag, tent, camp stove. A thermos sat in the cup holder, still half full of what looked like coffee. On the passenger seat lay a leather journal, closed but with several bookmarks protruding from its pages. I tried the door handle. Locked. No signs of struggle or forced entry, just a vehicle patiently waiting for its owner's return. The trail began innocuously enough. Well-maintained boardwalk sections winding between massive nurse logs draped in club moss. My boots made hollow sounds on the wet planks, echoing strangely in the fog. I'd walked this route hundreds of times, but today each familiar landmark seemed subtly wrong, as if the forest had shifted during the night. At the junction, I found Kellerman's first marker. Literally, a small orange flag tied to a huckleberry bush about 30 feet off the main trail. University researchers often use these temporary markers to relocate study sites. I marked the GPS coordinates and followed the faint path Kellerman had beaten through the understory. The fog grew thicker as I climbed away from the river valley. Moisture beaded on every surface, dripping constantly from the canopy above. My radio reception began to weaken, the usual chatter from headquarters fading to occasional bursts of static. Normal for this terrain, but it always made me uneasy. Communication was a ranger's lifeline. Kellerman's trail led upward through increasingly dense vegetation. I found 2 more orange flags, each marking turns toward areas I'd rarely explored. The mycologist had been thorough in his route marking, which should have made tracking him easier. Instead, I felt a growing unease I couldn't identify. At 08:45, I reached what appeared to be Kellerman's study site. A natural clearing opened among the massive tree trunks, carpeted with fallen leaves in brilliant yellows and russets. Several large logs showed signs of recent examination, bark samples removed, small holes drilled for core samples. A digital camera sat on one of the logs, its lens cap dangling from a strap. I approached carefully, scanning for any sign of the missing researcher. The camera's LCD screen was cracked, but the device still functioned. Scrolling through the stored images, I saw dozens of photographs documenting various fungi, oyster mushrooms, chicken of the woods, and several species I couldn't identify. The timestamps showed the photos were taken yesterday afternoon between 1500 and 1630 hours. The final image made me pause. It showed Kellerman himself, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an enthusiastic grin, kneeling beside a massive fallen cedar. He wore a red flannel shirt and khaki hiking pants, but something in the background caught my attention. A dark shape among the trees, partially obscured by fog. It could have been another tree trunk, or a rock formation, or it could have been something else. I examined the photo more closely, zooming in until the pixels blurred. The dark shape had an oddly vertical quality, too regular for natural formation, almost like a person standing very still. My radio squawked, making me jump. The voice was distorted by static but recognizable as dispatch. Blackwood, status report, teams approaching, position. Blackwood here, I responded, but got only static in return. I tried again. adjusting my position to find better reception. Nothing but white noise and occasional fragments of transmission. I was on my own. Following Kellerman's trail beyond the study site proved increasingly difficult. The orange flags continued, but the intervals grew longer and the path less defined. Fog pressed in from all directions, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet. Every sound seemed amplified and distorted. The drip of moisture, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant call of what might have been a loon. At 09:30, I found Kellerman's backpack. It hung from a branch about 8 feet off the ground, suspended by its shoulder straps like some macabre ornament. The positioning was wrong, too deliberate, too neat. No accident or animal encounter would result in such careful placement. I used my hiking poles to bring the pack down, handling it as potential evidence. The contents were meticulously organized: field notebooks, specimen containers, sampling tools, a lunch that remained untouched. Everything a mycologist would need for a day's field work. Everything except the person who owned it. But the pack's placement bothered me more than its contents. In 6 years of search and rescue operations, I'd learned to read the landscape for clues. This wasn't random. Someone had hung the pack where it would be found, positioned it precisely to draw attention. Someone wanted me here. The realization hit like ice water in my veins. I spun in a slow circle, scanning the fog-shrouded forest. Every shadow could hide an observer. Every tree trunk could conceal a threat. The silence pressed against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat. My radio crackled again, this time with a clearer transmission. "Cooper, can you hear me? This is important." The voice wasn't dispatch. It was male, unfamiliar, speaking my first name with inappropriate familiarity. I keyed my radio carefully. "This is Ranger Blackwood. Identify yourself." Silence stretched for 30 seconds before the voice returned, now with an edge of amusement. "You don't recognize me, Cooper? I'm hurt. We worked together for almost 2 years." My blood went cold. Only Rangers and a few close colleagues used my first name on the radio. But the voice didn't match anyone currently on the Olympic Peninsula roster. "Identify yourself and your location immediately." Laughter echoed from the radio speaker, distorted by static but unmistakably genuine. "Come now, Cooper. You're standing in my living room. Show some courtesy." I clicked off the radio and tried switching to the emergency frequency. Dead air. Then the backup channel. Nothing but static. Someone was jamming my communications or had compromised the entire system. The forest seemed to press closer around me. Every principle of ranger training said to retreat, establish contact with headquarters, wait for backup. But Ambrose Kellerman was still missing, and I was his only immediate hope of rescue. The thought of explaining to his family that I'd abandoned the search because of radio interference made my stomach clench. I continued following the sporadic orange flags, now certain they were leading me into a trap. Each marker drew me deeper into unfamiliar territory, away from established trails and toward the park's remote interior. The fog grew so thick I could barely see my own feet. My GPS unit showed my location as a small dot surrounded by vast green emptiness. At 10:15, I found the first sign of real trouble. Ambrose Kellerman's red flannel shirt hung from a branch like a flag of surrender. The fabric was torn but unstained, removed carefully rather than violently. 30 feet away, his hiking boots sat neatly beside a fallen log, laces untied, and tongues pulled out as if their owner had simply stepped out of them. The arrangement was too precise to be natural. Someone had staged this scene, creating breadcrumbs to lead me forward. But toward what? My radio hissed to life again. "Finding everything you need, Cooper." This time I didn't respond, but the voice continued anyway. "Ambrose is such a dedicated researcher. Even now he's helping with my own field study. Would you like to see his progress?" "Where is he?" I spoke aloud, not trusting the radio. The response came immediately, as if the speaker were monitoring multiple frequencies. "Close, very close, but you'll need to come alone if you want to see him alive." Every instinct screamed that I should retreat, call for backup, treat this as a hostage situation. But the fog had become a living thing around me, and I was no longer certain I could find my way back to the trailhead. My GPS showed my location, but the topographic features were unfamiliar. I'd been led into a section of the park I'd never thoroughly explored. The voice on the radio had mentioned working together. Only one person fit that description, someone who'd know my patterns, my protocols, my weaknesses. 3 years ago, the Park Service had quietly dismissed a ranger named Marcus Thorne after a series of incidents involving inappropriate contact with visitors and evidence of substance abuse. I'd been part of the investigation team, had written one of the reports that led to his termination. Marcus had sworn revenge during his dismissal hearing, claiming we'd destroyed his life over minor infractions. He'd vanished immediately afterward, and rumors suggested he'd gone to ground somewhere in the backcountry. If Marcus was behind this, he'd have intimate knowledge of park geography, communication frequencies, and search protocols. He'd know exactly how to lead a rescue operation astray. The orange flags continued, spaced now at irregular intervals that suggested their placer was becoming less careful or more confident. I followed them like a condemned man walking toward execution, knowing each step carried me further from safety, but unable to abandon the search. At 1100, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing glimpses of unfamiliar terrain. I found myself in a narrow valley I didn't recognize, surrounded by steep slopes covered in dense second-growth forest. No established trails were visible, and my GPS showed I was nearly 3 miles from the nearest marked path. That's when I heard Ambrose Kellerman screaming. The sound echoed off the valley walls, impossible to locate precisely. Raw terror and agony combined in a voice that no longer sounded entirely human. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the drip of moisture from overhead branches. I ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush without concern for stealth. My radio crackled with laughter as I stumbled over hidden roots and pushed through grabbing branches. "He's been very helpful," the voice said conversationally. "Amazing what a person will reveal when properly motivated. Did you know he has a daughter? 8 years old. Lives with her mother in Bellingham." I stopped running. The threat was clear, and it changed everything. This wasn't just about Kellerman anymore. "What do you want?" I shouted at the fog. "Recognition," came the immediate reply. "Professional courtesy, an acknowledgement of my expertise. Marcus?" I said his name like a question, but I was already certain. Ranger Marcus Thorne, formerly of Olympic National Park. Emphasis on formerly, thanks to your thorough investigation. The radio fell silent for several minutes while I tried to process the situation. Marcus had been unhinged during his employment, but this level of premeditation suggested complete psychological collapse. He'd spent 3 years planning this encounter, studying my patterns, waiting for the right opportunity. "Where is Kellerman?" I called out. "Safe, secured, contributing to science in his own way." A pause. "He's been telling me fascinating things about fungal networks. Did you know that some species can communicate across vast distances through underground connections? They share resources, coordinate responses to threats, even send warnings to other organisms." The academic language mixed with implied violence made my skin crawl. I want to hear his voice. "Proof of life." "Of course. Professional standards must be maintained." The radio crackled, then transmitted what sounded like muffled whimpering. After several seconds, Kellerman's voice came through clearly. "Please. He says he'll let me go if you come alone. Please don't leave me." The transmission cut to static. I stood in the fog-shrouded valley, weighing my options. Every protocol demanded I retreat and wait for backup. But backup might arrive too late, and Marcus clearly had contingency plans involving Kellerman's family. I was trained for search and rescue, not hostage negotiation with a deranged former colleague. My radio hissed again. "You're thinking too hard, Cooper. The solution is simple. Follow the flags. Come alone. We'll have a professional conversation about your future career prospects." The threat was unmistakable. Marcus wasn't just holding Kellerman hostage, he was targeting me specifically, using the missing researcher as bait. This was personal revenge disguised as a rescue operation. But I couldn't abandon Kellerman. The man had been terrorized for hours, possibly tortured, and his only hope was a ranger who was walking into an obvious trap. I checked my sidearm, ensuring a round was chambered. 6 years of law enforcement training would have to suffice against someone who'd had 3 years to prepare this encounter. The orange flags led deeper into the valley, toward what looked like a natural amphitheater formed by converging ridgelines. The fog thinned enough to reveal the skeletal remains of trees killed by some past fire, their bare branches reaching toward the overcast sky like accusing fingers. At 11:30, I found Marcus Thorne's camp. It was a masterpiece of wilderness survival, virtually invisible until you were standing in it. A lean-to shelter built against a massive boulder, camouflaged with local vegetation, and positioned to command views of all approaches. Solar panels provided power for radio equipment that looked military-grade. Food stores, water filtration, weapons cache, everything needed for extended backcountry living. And in the center of the camp, Ambrose Kellerman sat tied to a chair. The mycologist was alive but in poor condition. His clothes were muddy and torn, his face showing signs of recent violence. Duct tape covered his mouth, and his eyes tracked frantically between me and something behind my left shoulder. I spun around as Marcus Thorne stepped from behind a tree not 10 feet away. He looked like a caricature of a mountain man, long beard, camouflage clothing, and eyes that held too much intensity. A rifle rested casually in his arms, not quite pointed at me but ready to be raised instantly. "Ranger Blackwood," he said with mock formality. "Welcome to my district office." I kept my hands visible but positioned near my sidearm. "Marcus, you look well. Clean living and honest work." He gestured around the camp. 3 years of studying the ecosystem from the inside. Amazing what you learn when you stop pretending to protect and serve. "Let Kellerman go. This is between us." Marcus laughed, a sound with sharp edges. "Is it? You destroyed my career, Cooper. 20 years of service and you wrote me off as damaged goods because of a few minor incidents." Minor incidents had included propositioning female hikers, confiscating alcohol from campers for personal use, and filing false reports to cover patrol deficiencies. But arguing with an armed paranoid seemed counterproductive. "I'm here," I said simply. "What do you want?" "Recognition. An admission that your investigation was biased and incomplete. A public apology for destroying my reputation." I glanced at Kellerman, who was making urgent sounds through the tape over his mouth. His eyes kept darting toward something behind Marcus's shelter. "Fine," I said. "You were treated unfairly. The investigation should have been more thorough." Marcus's smile was genuinely pleased. "That's a start. But words are cheap, aren't they? Actions have consequences, real consequences." He shifted the rifle slightly, and I realized he'd never intended to negotiate. This was execution disguised as conversation, revenge dressed up as justice. The camp, the radio intercepts, the elaborate chase through the forest, all designed to get me isolated and helpless. "Kellerman has nothing to do with this," I said desperately. "No, but he makes excellent leverage. Amazing how cooperative people become when threatened with harm to innocents." Marcus's expression hardened. "You should have thought about consequences before you ruined my life." The rifle began rising toward my chest. I had perhaps 2 seconds before Marcus fired, not enough time to draw my sidearm. My only advantage was that he wanted to talk, to explain his grievances before pulling the trigger. That's when Ambrose Kellerman proved that academic researchers could be surprisingly resourceful. The mycologist had worked one hand free of his restraints and managed to grab something from the ground beside his chair. He hurled it with perfect accuracy at Marcus's head, just as the rifle reached firing position. The projectile was a rock the size of a softball, and it caught Marcus in the temple with an audible crack. The rifle fired harmlessly into the air as its owner staggered sideways, momentarily stunned. I drew my sidearm and had it trained on Marcus before he could recover. "Drop the rifle." Marcus blinked away blood from a scalp laceration, his expression cycling through confusion, rage, and what might have been respect. The rifle clattered to the ground. "Hands where I can see them," I ordered, moving to untie Kellerman while keeping Marcus covered. The mycologist gasped as I removed the tape from his mouth. "There are others," he whispered urgently. "He's not alone." Before I could ask what he meant, movement in the trees around the camp answered the question. 2 figures emerged from concealment, both dressed in woodland camouflage and carrying weapons. They moved with the disciplined coordination of military training. Marcus's laughter was wet with blood from his head wound. "Did you think I'd been living alone for 3 years, Cooper? The wilderness attracts all kinds of refugees from your civilized world." The new arrivals flanked me with professional efficiency, their weapons trained with obvious competence. I kept my pistol aimed at Marcus, but the tactical situation had shifted decisively against me. "Lower your weapon," one of them ordered. His voice carried an authority that suggested military or law enforcement background. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they'd shoot me regardless of compliance. Kellerman was free but unarmed and in no condition to fight. 3 against 1, with my target spread too far apart for any realistic chance of success. But as I calculated odds of survival, a new sound reached the camp, the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors echoing off the valley walls. Marcus's expression shifted from triumph to concern. "You called for backup?" "My communications were jammed," I reminded him. The helicopter sound grew louder, joined by the distant noise of multiple vehicles. Marcus's radio equipment began receiving transmissions from what was clearly a large-scale search operation. His 2 companions exchanged glances that suggested this development hadn't been anticipated. Whatever their plan, it apparently required isolation and secrecy. "Change of plans," the military-trained one announced. He raised his weapon toward Kellerman. "Eliminate the witnesses." That's when my ranger training finally proved useful. 6 years of wilderness law enforcement had taught me that desperate situations sometimes required desperate measures. Instead of trying to shoot all 3 men, I put 2 rounds into Marcus's radio equipment. The explosion was more dramatic than I'd expected, apparently triggered by the solar panel battery array. Burning electronics and chemical smoke filled the camp, creating instant chaos and confusion. I grabbed Kellerman and dragged him toward the tree line as shouts erupted behind us. The fog provided additional cover as we crashed through underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth. Helicopters circled overhead while we stumbled toward what I hoped was higher ground. My GPS was useless. The device had been damaged during our escape. But the sound of rotors provided rough directional guidance. We climbed for 20 minutes before reaching a clearing large enough for helicopter landing. I used my emergency whistle to signal our location while Kellerman collapsed against a tree, exhausted but coherent. There were 4 of them, he gasped between breaths, living off-grid for years. Marcus was the leader, but the others, military deserters maybe? They'd been hunting people for sport. The rescue helicopter spotted us minutes later, and I'd never been happier to see the Forest Service logo on aircraft. As we lifted off, I could see smoke rising from the valley below where Marcus's camp burned. Ground teams were already moving to contain the suspects. The debriefing took 3 days and involved multiple law enforcement agencies. Marcus Thorne was found dead at the scene, apparently killed during the explosion. His companions had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind evidence of at least 6 other victims over the past 2 years. Kellerman recovered fully from his ordeal and returned to his research, though he never again worked alone in remote areas. His daughter sent me a crayon drawing of a ranger with a big smile, which I keep framed in my office. But the case changed me in ways I'm still processing. For 6 years, I'd seen Olympic National Park as a place of natural beauty that occasionally required human intervention. Now I know it also harbors human predators who've rejected civilization entirely, who view other people as prey to be hunted for entertainment. The forest hasn't felt the same since that October morning. Every fog-shrouded valley could hide watchers. Every remote trail might lead to a carefully prepared trap. The ravens eventually returned to their normal routines, but I understand now why they'd fled. Some predators walk on 2 legs and use radios to coordinate their hunts. They know our protocols, our weaknesses, our commitment to helping others even at personal risk. They count on our humanity as the very weapon they'll use to destroy us. I still love my job, still believe in protecting and serving the public, but I've learned to listen more carefully to what the forest is trying to tell me. When the animals go quiet, when the fog seems too thick, when radio transmissions carry voices that sound almost familiar. That's when I remember Ambrose Kellerman tied to a chair in a madman's camp, and Marcus Thorne's eyes holding too much intensity as he explained his 3-year plan for revenge. Sometimes the most dangerous wilderness isn't found among wild animals or treacherous terrain. Sometimes it's found in the human heart, grown twisted by isolation and grievance into something that no longer recognizes the difference between justice and murder. The mountains don't care about our conflicts, our betrayals, our need for vengeance. They simply provide the perfect stage for human nature to reveal its darkest possibilities, far from witnesses and consequences. That's the lesson I learned during the fall of 2023, when a routine missing person case became a hunting expedition where I was the prey. It's a lesson that keeps me awake some nights, listening to the wind in the trees and wondering who else might be out there, patient and prepared, waiting for the right opportunity to turn protector into victim. The wilderness is vast and unforgiving, but the most terrifying predators it contains aren't the ones that hunt by instinct. They're the ones that hunt by choice.